to take back to you. So let me introduce you, Jessica Costa. It's my pleasure to present Dr. Costa today. She might not remember that I first met her, it was via email, when she was leading education in radio back in June last year. We were emailing back and forth, and I could perceive her passion just by reading her emails, as she would guide me to record a successful radio lesson in Spanish at that time. Her passion for ELLs comes from listening to her father's stories of her experiences as a multilingual immigrant. Dr. Costa has a vast experience teaching students the love of language and providing professional development for teachers and educational leaders nationally and internationally. She also brings her experience with National Board Certification in English as a new language, strict state, district, and school-wide leadership roles. Those allow her to connect and partner with educators to support quality instruction for our English language learners. She also hosts a monthly teaching leadership with ESL teachers who share strategies for everybody, and she will tell you about it in soon. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Costa today.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here with you all. And I see some of you are already participating in the chat, which is great. I hope to really use your ideas to enhance the presentation that I have prepared for you. And as I said, I have prepared some slides for you, but of course this is meant to really support you. And as you have questions or other ideas, we'll use those as well. So thank you, and I will get us started. And before we dig in, actually, just reminding you, if you are joining live, that as you're sharing your ideas, we want to make sure everybody can see them. So if you can make sure next to the to box in your chat, you have all panelists and attendees, and that way everybody will be able to see everybody else's ideas. So thank you. And I wanted to start out really honoring what you all are bringing to our learning session today, what the skills, the strategies you're using, because you are working on building literacy and specifically writing skills for English learners. And so you all have a variety of ways that you are doing that. So I always like to start by honoring your ideas and bringing them into the whole group. So thank you. So I'm going to speak specifically today about different ways we empower our English learners through our writing instruction and tasks. So our outcomes, you'll see me look back and forth. I have the chat on one screen so I can make sure I'm staying up to date with any of your questions or comments, and then I have the presentation on another. So that's why you'll see me looking back and forth. But our intended outcomes for today that you would apply into your instruction when you have students is really teaching them to focus and highlight on their strengths. We want to build the identity of students as writers, and we can do that in a variety of ways. And then, of course, incorporating some of the different approaches and strategies that we discussed today. We're going to be looking at a language development tool that can help guide your development of lessons, development of supports, and providing feedback that can help students develop the complexity and voice and all of the skills that we would want to see as students develop language proficiency. So I did want to refer you to an infographic that is available on the VDOE website. When you get the PowerPoint, you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint. All of the images are hyperlinked. So when you get the PowerPoint and you click on this screenshot, it will bring you to the actual document on the VDOE page. And this, I worked with my colleagues at the Virginia Department of Education in the English department to create a list of best strategies and ideas for supports as we are developing students' literacy skills. So I wanted to start out directing you to that resource, but also as a frame for a lot of what we're going to discuss today are the ideas are incorporated in this infographic. So we're really going to start by thinking about how we motivate our learners. I'll give you a moment to read the screen. I pulled this quote from social media. I saw it and I was like, yes, that's perfect. And it's just been kind of sitting in my mega PowerPoint of all the different things I've seen that I might want to incorporate in a future presentation. I said, this is going to be perfect to start out our discussion about writing. How we build and what we pour into students matters. And so we can even have structures as we begin writing instruction or any instruction that affirms students' skills and their backgrounds. And so I also included a number of affirmations that can be specific to writing. But again, we want to build a positive identity for our students as writers. And not only do we implement these affirmations and have students repeat them, and we know we have students at different language levels. And so even a beginning language learner can start by repeating some of these affirmations. And as they develop more of the language, then they understand more of what it means to them. But we have the opportunity to get them excited about writing. If they feel that they are a good writer and the feedback, the actions we do are affirming as well. So when we give feedback, we're focusing on strengths to start, and we're always building, we're always supporting to advance their skills and develop that, as I said, positive identity as a writer. And so there is a lot of research based on writing development, and for English learners specifically, how much writing and literacy development, reading, writing, as literacy skills, the development of those is based on their oral language skills within, if we're thinking about English literacy, then building that background in the English oracy. So I wanted to take a moment and get you involved pretty early on in the presentation. Why do you think starting with speaking may help English learners build their writing skills? And making sure that in the chat, you are putting all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your answers. So why do you think we should start with speaking activities and opportunities for interaction? How does that build writing skills? Brandy, if you can speak it, you can write it. Thank you for that idea. Putting it on paper. Thanks, Courtney. So for English learners, and English learners, they're assessed annually in 4 domains. So speaking, reading, listening, and writing. And certain students may have strengths in one more than another. And certain students will have a higher speaking ability, even if it's not fully captured on that access test, as students are still learning to navigate, trying to interact with the computer for that. But we can leverage their speaking skills. But it's also about building background. And when students were using that, we know reading comprehension is a great deal built based on the background knowledge and understanding. And so we have an opportunity within these oracy exercises to build student background on a topic for which we want them to read and write. And I see a couple of other comments coming in. Thank you for those who are using all panelists and attendees. Lots of extra discussion time pre-writing. And I love, Brandy, that you said some of their pre-writing speaking needs to be, can be in their native language. Absolutely, that's another part of honoring the skills that they're bringing. And Brandy, I think you might have seen my PowerPoint in advance because we're going to talk about that. I'm just kidding. We give them an opportunity to even hear more ideas. So if we know that we want students writing to be elaborate and share different perspectives or multiple ideas, we really help to support that. We set them up for success, if that's the expectation, by having students share multiple ideas that students, as they're hearing some peer ideas, that may ignite some deeper thinking on their own, that then we see a stronger and clearer writing based on that opportunity to hear from their peers, really build language. Their peers may use some new language that they hadn't heard, but because it's in a context, a meaningful context, now they can take it, they can use it to build their own skills. So thank you for that reflection. And as Brandy helped to introduce us into the value of leveraging students' first language skills, or primary language, native language, home language, it's referred to in a variety of ways depending on what you're reading or hearing. So we want to encourage students' use of their first language because they have skills. And I hear a lot, people will say, you know, well, the English learners don't have any, you know, they're not literate in their first language. And I like to push back on that respectfully. And that, again, if we're thinking about oracy, students have plenty of skills with language in their home language. So it's a matter of leveraging that. And maybe they haven't had as much formal reading and writing instruction, but we can use that to build literacy just like we would with any student who, you know, is raised speaking only English. We use their first language to help build the literacy in that language. So while we're not teaching literacy necessarily in the home languages, we do have programs that do that, our dual language programs. But in an English, a program focused on English development, then there are still opportunities to have students use that language and use the skills that they do have. And then we can use different interpretive devices or translation, electronic translation options to help us understand their ideas, which then we can model how to bring those ideas into English. And also, just from the culturally responsive lens, not all students will be fully comfortable using their home language in groups where others don't understand that language or use that language. So also keeping that in mind, that we want to encourage and promote their first language use, but if they're not comfortable, then we continue to build their English and just provide that safe space if and when they are comfortable. And so again, I want to have a stopping point for a moment and get us engaged. So as we're thinking about how we build on students' first language and connect to students' first language, one of those strategies specifically is using cognates. And cognates are the words that look, sound the same between two languages in this case. And so there are some words on the screen. I'd like you to see how many of them you know in English. So any of these you think you know what they are in English, if you can put those into the chat, please. And if you are a Spanish speaker or writer, then it might be a little cheating for you to get involved, but you can model for us maybe one or two of the answers. So just waiting a moment to see. Oh, Courtney, thank you. Courtney, you sent to all panelists, you said alliteration, author, dialogue, conflict, edit, characterization, description, biography. Somebody else put in introduction. Awesome. So tone, there you go. I didn't know so many of you already spoke Spanish. And I say that, of course, as a joke, but how we can connect to students' first languages, you know, the word alliteration, if they've had some background, you know, instruction in that aspect, then you can say, oh, it's the same in that language. Or even if they don't know that word in Spanish yet, as we're giving instructions and examples and activities on alliteration, we can still connect back and say, oh, this is the same in Spanish. So we're connecting to their home language. So even if they don't have that specific term, they feel more valued, included, because there's that even short, quick language connection that we can make. So the question Brandy asked about most Spanish cognates are higher level English vocabulary. I don't think that I've thought about that. But the word false or author, those are kind of words that students might learn even from the younger ages. I know my sister teaches kindergarten and she's talking about like illustrations and author, using the word even to use, but evidence might also be, depending, I guess it depends on what we feel is the higher level, but I know a lot of these words are part of even kindergarten and preschool words. My niece and nephews, you know, might use some of these based on like hearing from us, opinion. I think my, 4-year-old niece or nephew, I would say my niece, she was a little bit sassier. If she didn't like what somebody said, she would say, well, that's your opinion. So bringing that in when they hear it modeled, then they can use it. So seeing those overlaps to say it's the same in your home language, or you might use this in your home language, but now we can just add English to that. We're always thinking about adding English to what the students are bringing. But Courtney, I love your comment about feeling excited that you can learn after seeing some cognates. Yes, and so another resource I used to even create that slide are multilingual dictionaries that are based on content areas. And so again, this is linked if you click on the hyperlink, but I also included the website. There are English language arts glossaries and then the guides for literary terms, and you can see they are available in a variety of languages. So if I have, most of my students when I taught besides Spanish were from Nepal. And so I could look up the word, I would pick a couple of words that were really critical for the lesson. So if we're doing plot or narrative, then I would want to look up some of those mean like character, plot, conflict in Nepali, and then I would put those up there as well. So this is a verified resource for pulling in the native language. And again, even if students aren't at the same reading grade level in their home language, just knowing that their language was included, or a quick, opportunity, if they can read in that language, hey, can you say this word for us? Now let's all learn Nepali. Just to build that love of language within the classroom, and for the early learners especially get really excited to go home and say, oh, I can speak Nepali now from their 1 or 2 words, but just igniting that motivation to learn is really important. And then another way we motivate students is just helping them to feel confident. And I think somebody in the chat earlier had said something about lots of practice and to build confidence. So just affirming that idea. And different ways we do that is really starting our writing instruction or even introduction to any lesson by connecting to a familiar or interesting topic to them. And with Esther Park's permission, I've used one of her examples of this or that. So getting students even to say a couple of words, phrases that helps them to describe one of their preferences, something that they would want to debate about, why is soccer better than basketball, or something to that nature. And then you can see also on the side, this is another social media example of just tell one similarity and difference, and then there's that support built in. And as we create these familiar opportunities, not only talking about what's familiar, but familiar structures for sharing their ideas, we can start to build their confidence. And then a lot of times, as we're thinking about English learners specifically, but I would say this happens with all of our beginning readers, writers, or developing readers and writers, we're going to make mistakes. I still make mistakes as a professional. There was a typo on the first slide I noticed just as we were about to begin. And so being vulnerable and honest about that with the learners to say mistakes are part of learning, and we catch ourselves, we're thinking, we're trying to get our ideas out. So we're, might rush through our writing or, work really fast because we're so excited and have so many ideas. But then we have an opportunity to go back and think about how we can make it even better. So I like to use that language of making things even better or clearer, so that we're always thinking about our, what might be called mistakes or errors, as an opportunity to grow. And always focusing on progress and not perfection. Again, as a fully proficient reader, writer in English, I still make errors and make mistakes. And so it's building that growth mindset within the students that is motivating, so that they don't feel let down, or they don't get a paperback that has all red marks, because then I'm not going to identify as much as, a writer if I feel like everything I do is wrong. But if my teacher continues to build into me, like, you're a really great writer, here's how we can be even better, that's a whole different way to really conceptualize writing and my development as a writer. And then we build confidence by providing some support. So as you can see in the example to the right, the teacher gave same or different. And so wanting the student to use those in the writing as a support. There's the visual that's a support there, instead of just saying swing and slide. Then the students can now understand what a swing and a slide is, and they can, add an idea about why it's same and different. And then another strategy for really building student motivation and growth in writing is by giving them some I can statements, so that they can describe their own development. This specifically, this page is included in an English Learner Teacher Toolkit. And I think Ms. Pignot, if you could put that link in the chat. A lot of the resources I'm going to share today actually come from that. It's I think about a 6 or 7 page document. And this one is based on the performance definitions for WIDA's reading or speaking and writing, specifically for the productive domains. And we can help students understand what these mean. So even from the beginning levels of language proficiency, teachers will say, well, the students don't have any English. And I say, they have something. There is something. How can we find out what they do know? And they might be using single words that are, high frequency, like no and yes, or bathroom. My middle schoolers learned the language chunk, can I go to the bathroom, really fast from hearing their other students, but it also meant something to them. And it was also a reprieve. If they needed a break, then they would take a quick bathroom break just to, take a brain break. And so they learned a longer chunk of language very fast. So always thinking about what do students know, even if it's those single words and phrases, they're still using English. So again, keeping that ISF-based mindset for us as teachers, but also building that in students so they don't feel discouraged when they hear all of this other English going on around them, that, we never want them to think, oh, I can't do this, or I don't know any English. You do know English, a couple of words, here are what they are. And we use that to build. We're always that idea of scaffolding up where students are and promoting that so that we keep that mindset, but also develop that mindset in our students is what's going to motivate them to progress and grow. And a lot of that is based on research, just, having students set goals. And so something like this can be used to help students set those goals. And so before we dig into any specific approaches for teaching writing, I just wanted to do a quick check-in to see if you had any comments, questions, ideas, more to share about motivating your English learners. And as we go, As you have ideas, I would encourage you to continue to put those into the chat so that we use this time and space, though short, as to build our community of learning and coming away with even more ideas. Of course, I have a few to share, but you all are doing the work and probably have many more than what I planned to share. So I hope that you share that expertise with us in the chat. So I want to go into some specific approaches for teaching writing. I had originally planned to do an activity that builds on the language experience approach, but then as I was looking through some of the other sessions, I noticed somebody already did. So I wanted to point you towards that video that is available as part of this conference, but also highlight that I think this is a really important one, and it builds students' reading, writing, speaking, listening, all in an integrated way, in a very meaningful way, connected to content areas and content topics. And so I do hope that you take time, if you haven't already, to watch that video. So another idea to build students' writing, even those who are starting from single words or phrases, is the picture word inductive model. And I have taken these examples from Mrs. Esther Park, who's done some work and collaborated with me at the state level to provide support. In digital world, what our digital or virtual instruction looks like for English learners. So starting with a picture, the content objective here was related to science and to describe part of the growth cycle and plants' needs. And so here we start with getting, oh great, Kim saw Jennifer's presentation and she said it was awesome. So starting with single words and phrases, what do students know about the topic? And giving them that time in this virtual space where they're adding sticky notes in Jamboard. And this could even be in the student's home language. And then based on what another student's put. So if one student puts fruta, which ends up being a, cognate, or the word for roots in another language, but then they see the English, it's a meaningful way to get that content vocabulary. And it's not from a list that I've given, but some of the language that other students have given. And as a teacher, I can still go in and I can put some of those in there so that it looks like another student might have added that. So it's really a collaborative space for building language. But then through prompting, the teacher can add to that language and say, okay, sometimes when we want to add information in detail, we use some adjectives. And how would you describe a tree? What are some words you would use to describe a tree or say something about a tree? And we call those adjectives. And so I can do like a mini grammar lesson. I don't have to use the word adjective if I have level ones, and that's not the exact, like if we're not in an ELA lesson where we're having to learn those words, then I don't have to use that word adjective. I can just say, what do you say about trees? How do you describe trees? And then I model that in English, we put those before the item we're talking about. Whether I use noun or not, again, is going to be connected to the standard you're focusing on. And then you can see the progression here. So I'll give you a moment to just really reflect and process the rest of how the activity might work. And so if we look at that very bottom slide, we see even from starting with single words and phrases within a lesson, we can build to a paragraph level. And if I have level 1 students, maybe I give them this paragraph for them to just practice copying for homework. And so it's a participation grade if they did their homework, and all they're doing is copying, because I don't know what English supports will be available outside of my time with them. So anything I give them to do is going to be that I've completely set them up for success. And here, I just want them to get used to writing longer pieces of text so that they know that that's the expectation. They don't have to do it to start. If I have that very newcomer student, maybe they're not doing any or much of that independently, but that they're still practicing writing sentences and starting to make connections to the word structure and or sentence order by putting the words together. So again, it's scaffolding up, even from those students who just walked into my classroom yesterday from a refugee camp. I had a lot of students coming in from, refugee camps from different countries in Africa. And, they may not have had access. Some of them I had to practice, how to hold a pencil. And maybe they were only writing the single words if we're just learning how to hold a writing utensil. But for those students who have some of that background, we're automatically going to start writing longer pieces of text connected to content. So this is not, we're writing the colors. I can add colors in here if during the adjective section if I wanted to make that meaningful, and I know my students needed some of that language in English. But again, the rigor is connected to grade level content of what students would need to learn or be able to do. And then another strategy, how we build writing, is by using the reading texts as mentor texts. So we use those to point out, this is how good writers can share their ideas. And this could even be a poem. It doesn't have to be a newspaper article or an essay. It could be, a graphic novel. There are different multi-modes in ways we interpret, receive, read information, view information. And so we provide those variety of ways students can see how information is delivered or presented. And then we use those strategically to build writing in a certain way. So I've added an article here from the New York Times on different ways to use mentor texts, and there are mentor texts actually incorporated, examples of them to use for teachers to build some writing skills. And so some of the ways the teachers shared they use the mentor text is maybe pointing out varied verbs. And as we're discussing word choice, we look at a piece of writing that has different verbs like pop and smash, or, infuriated. So we're looking at, some of those shades of meaning of where language and word choice becomes very precise. And we talk about that intentionally, why we choose words in that way, what words might be appropriate. Another idea, if students feel like they're not writers and they don't know what to write about, by showing these other texts that students have written also shows you can really write on any topic. The topic itself doesn't make you a writer, just you putting your ideas on paper in a way that, that speaks to you or makes sense to you makes you a writer. So again, building that identity as or positive identity as a writer. And then themes like taking a stand, more accessible, because there are some mentor texts that are related to ideas about social justice and civil rights. And so as we're trying to incorporate those for lessons, and we, a lot of times the text might be really complex that we find in our other resources where we're looking for sample texts, some of these student supports might be a great text to really dig into an idea and use to build writing. And so I'll give you a moment to share any ideas, questions, reflections on strategies, specific strategies you use to build students' writing. And if you have any of those as we continue, please put those into the chat. I'm now going to bring us into a section on understanding the English language development rubrics. We're going to take some time to look at an example rubric, and we will put the link in the chat for you to the WIDA performance definitions. That is the rubric for the access tests that students take that determine what level they are. So if you get a score report that shows students are level 2.5, you can look to these performance definitions and get some more information about the type of language the students either understood in terms of reading and listening or produced in speaking and writing. And so the one that you have in the chat is the speaking and writing, since we're talking about that for this session. So this next activity, I wanted you to really think about your own language development rubrics in terms of writing. So at different grade levels, there are rubrics for writing that can be associated with the SOL or maybe not necessarily. You might use other rubrics for writing development. So reflecting on those. And then as we dig into the performance definitions, our language objective, what we're going to practice today in this activity, is comparative language. And so I also want to point out how I'm modeling the language objective connected to the content objective. So if we're analyzing rubrics to tell similarities and differences, then comparative language is really important for me to be able to do that. So as trying to support English learners in development, which also will support their writing, we're very explicit about what comparative language is, what language helps us to do what the SOL, the standard, has asked us to do. And so then I build in these kinds of supports for students here. So if we're talking about similarities and differences, I'm very explicit about the language that takes. And then I also provide multiple options for students, as I know I have multiple levels in one classroom. I might have beginning learners where I can teach both very quickly and then can get them starting with a sentence frame. And I can have answer banks of how they're similar and different if that would be supportive in this activity. And then, you know, modeling how to use negatives in terms of, if we're looking at the differences side, the ELD rubric has blank, but the ELA one does not. So how do we use that negative? So a mini grammar lesson just based on the types of language frames I support or I incorporate. And then I'm always trying to build different levels. So if we notice on the differences side, one of them uses but, another one uses however. And so I'm exposing them to different ways students can contrast. It's not always but or different, but they might read a text that uses however or conversely. And so I want to, depending on the grade level, set them up for what would be coming in a text or what would be appropriate for the kinds of things that they're reading or needing to write. So here, if you have not pulled up the performance definitions, here is the screenshot. And so I wanted to give you a moment to really process this chart and then write some of those ideas, how your language rubrics or your writing rubrics are the same or different than the chart that you see on the screen. So I'll give you a moment to that, or just really to do that, or to ask any questions you have about the chart that you see on the screen. I wanted to give you time to process, and then I can answer as needed. So Mary made a connection. Many of these would fall into the written expression on the general writing rubric. Thank you. So Mary, I'm going to use your answer, if it's okay, to model some reframing with the language objective. I might say both of these rubrics have items that pertain to writing or written expression. Or the ELD rubric and the general writing rubric both include ideas about written expression. So thank you for giving me that opportunity to model the language objective again. Brandy, would you mind unmuting and telling us a little bit more about your process for focusing on one piece per student? It's okay if not, if you have a lot of background noise or children. It is Saturday. Just if you wanted to share a little bit more. But I think what Brandy says is important is starting, just thinking about one thing. And so here I'm going to relate it, no worries. I'm going to relate it to the three dimensions that we see here. Word phrase level, or the dimension, is vocabulary. And I think that's where a lot of teachers are very comfortable, is the vocabulary level. So if we're thinking about the sentence dimension, which is like the structure of the language and the sentences, we can think here about how students vary their sentence and how complex it is. So if we see at the beginning levels, their phrase level, maybe not even a complete sentence. But then as we get to level 2, maybe they're repeating some sentence patterns. Like, what do you think? What do you feel? How do you feel? How are you? So the chunks of language that they can start repeating. And so when we analyze a piece of students' writing, even English speakers and writers, we could go through and apply this and say, oh, a lot of their sentences start the same. They're using the same structure. I like, I play, I want, I need. We would say that that's very repetitive. But then as we get up to the next level, we're looking at how much they vary their sentences. Maybe they say, I play, or I like to play. And then the next sentence is, when my friends come over, we blank. So right there, I even have a little bit of variety with 2 sentences. I can see some greater complexity just based on the use of when my friends come over. That dependent clause makes it, one, varied. It has a different structure, but also more complex just based on the structure itself. And so I might look at their sentences and how repetitive or varied, complex or simple those sentences are. And that can be something I'm focusing on to build their writing skills. And if we're thinking about the discourse dimension, this is where we are looking for how much more detail students are adding, how their ideas are expanded here, which builds in a little bit of that sentence dimension. If you look at level 4, the top bullet reads short, expanded, in some complex sentences. So then that's even integrating some of that sentence level. And so maybe we want to focus on the discourse dimension as a way to start to see how much writing students are producing, how organized or how detailed, how complex the student writing is. So different ways you can really use this chart to, as we're going to get into in the next section, analyze student writing and then provide ideas for moving them forward, giving feedback that promotes extended, enhanced language use. So just wanting to take a moment to see if there are any other ideas or questions about the performance definitions and how they might be used in collaboration with your current writing rubrics. And as you have those, feel free to put those in the chat. There will be some time at the end for questions. So again, wanting to reemphasize that as students are sharing their ideas, we want to provide a language objective that supports the functional language. And what I mean by functional language is, what is the language that might be indicated in your content objective? And here, if it's similarities and differences, then that tells me the function of language is to compare and contrast. And so I want to build in language objectives to build student writing connections. If we think back to that discourse, part of that is how students organize their ideas. And so when we provide these kinds of language frames, we're teaching students how to organize their ideas to this specific function of compare and contrast. How do we build those or explain the relationships between two items or two ideas by adding in these functional language pieces, which you might think of as transitional phrases, signal words. We've heard them described in different ways, but we make those explicit and give students the opportunity to practice. So we're not only supporting the content of language rubrics in this case, or characters within a story, or different scientific processes, whatever that topic is that students need to compare and contrast or tell the similarities and differences. We're also providing the language and modeling how to retell or give information about those similarities and differences. And so that's where our language objective comes. So we want to make sure students are practicing that in their content-focused lessons. And one of the supports that is in that EL Teacher Toolkit, we put the link in earlier, is a scholar sheet. And there are two versions. There's one for more primary grade levels, maybe K through 2, 3, and then the upper elementary and into secondary. And the differences are just the amount of example expressions that are available or modeled there, and the number of sentence language frames. So as you're thinking about building in language objectives, which is really important for English learners, not just in literacy development, but across the content areas, to set them up for set them up for success, then we are explicit about the language that connects back to the content SOL or skill. And so I encourage you to take a look at those and start incorporating some language objectives into your literacy lessons. And then we're going to dig into how do we apply that performance definition tool to looking at student writing. And I spoke on this just a bit, but as students move from the level 1 to the level 5, then we're looking for more complexity, more variety, more precision in their language use. So just a different way to graphically represent some of the main ideas of the performance definitions chart is on the screen. And as we're thinking about our feedback, how does our feedback move students up that trajectory? Connecting back to the idea of motivation, when we can provide feedback that honors what students have done or tell them their glows. And we refer that back to the rubric. So students know what is expected of them because we explain that rubric, we provide that rubric for them in advance. We do some scaffolding so they understand the what their next steps are. If you've done some goal setting, then we're talking about their development along towards those goals or according to the rubric. And then of course, our grows or ideas for making our writing even better would connect to the higher levels. So we're really analyzing where students are, and then how do we intentionally build them to the next step. And so here is a persuasive essay. This was done by one of my 8th graders when I was teaching. And they were practicing for their 8th grade writing SOL, and they were using a 4-square model. And this was the writing as a result of that pre-writing activity. And so I'd like you to take a moment thinking about what did she do well, and then what specific feedback would you give to her? So thinking about the glows and the grows and the performance definitions. What did she do well according to the performance definitions or even your writing rubric? And then what are some next steps for her? So I'll give you some time to read, process, and put in the chat. Oh, I was muted. I was saying you guys are a quiet group this Saturday. Well, I will go ahead and share some of my ideas. Oh, Kim, thank you so much. Kim in the chat put there's evidence of logical thoughts. She plays a game with the students that it's called the why game. So after each sentence written, I asked why and see if they can answer their own question to expand. Debbie says she has a good overall framework. Debbie, what do you mean by good overall framework? Are you referring to the organization? Oops. I'll give Debbie a moment to add to her idea in the chat, and I will share just for the sake of times. Oh, and Courtney said provided a conclusion. Yep, so the organization of beginning first, second, third grade. Thank you. So my feedback to the student was first, of course, focusing on her glows, and I am very specific. I highlight what I liked from her, or what, according to the rubric, she met. The thesis or the clear statement in terms of the introduction, emphasizing, I can tell she's used that 4-square idea organizer that we had talked about. So some of the organization, the language to introduce her points. I always like to, if this was a persuasive essay, so to speak, then I want to, go back to what we said is important as part of the function of persuasive essays, and part of that is some kind of emotional appeal or call to action. And so that was clear. So I'm going back to what the instructions were for this genre of writing, or some of the skills, the strategies writers use in this genre of writing. And then again, I just kind of scripted out what my typical response to students were. Like, we're always trying to become stronger writers to enhance our skills. And then I'm going to share some ideas with you. So as we move into like the editing reflection phase, they have some choices. And I want to be clear, I would not go over all 3 of these necessarily. I would look at the student goals, and I would look at that dimension, and I would focus on one of the dimensions. So for example, if we had identified the goal for this student is to use more precise language, then my feedback, the only feedback she's going to get from me in terms of next steps are on that goal of precise vocabulary and language. And so then I'm very clear, I point out, and it was easy to color code in the virtual world. Instead of trying to write with 7 different highlighters, in terms of if I had the paper version, then I would just highlight or have, use one and then have arrows or write right above it, different ways depending on what the writing piece was. And I did want to point out to her how many times she used the word separate or separated. And so I would want to talk about repetition and why it's important we have different words. And so sharing what some of those are, I could tell her to go to the dictionary or go to a thesaurus and find more words. And I'll be honest, I started that when I first started teaching. And then they would choose words that didn't fit within that context or were the wrong part of speech. And so I realized I needed to model what they were in that context, because then it's a meaningful context for them and they're more likely to use and incorporate the word when we've had a quick discussion or it relates back to something that they're connected, that they've written and we're talking about it, I guess is the main difference, like why we use this word in this context. So even a quick writing conference. So giving, I'm modeling. That's one of the things to remember with language development. We're always modeling for them, just like we would if we had children or we as language learners ourselves, our first language, we copied what our parents said to start to make understanding of our world or build that understanding. And so it's the same thing as we're adding language, if we're adding English to their home language or languages, then we want to tell them the words in that context because they won't necessarily know the ones in English otherwise. So we are the language models for them. So giving them that language rather than having them try to figure it out. To ensure success, I provide that for them. So if we're looking at the sentence level, how do we vary structures? So at the sentence dimension, we want to teach students how to say the same idea in a different way. So changing the structure of the sentence. And this is where we get to that sentence variety and written expression. So I would choose no more than 3 ways to build to the next level in terms of variety. And so I would model for them how to do it. Because I could ask, how else would you say this? And if a student's at maybe a 1 or a 2, and maybe even beginning 3s, they may not be able to, they may not have as much language right now or think they do to make those changes. So if I'm still teaching the skill of changing language structure, then I model for students how that works. Now, she may have ideas because of all the sentence frames that we've used in lessons prior and how, I'm very explicit. We say the same thing. We can do it in different ways. So she could have brought a lot to this, but I still want to model in context to just add to what she already does have. And so even a strategy of asking a question instead of writing a sentence, those kinds of little pieces that I'm teaching students in the context of their own writing. And then for the discourse level, how we want, or discourse dimension, I'm sorry, what are our next steps to help it become even more organized and clear and elaborate? And so maybe I work with her on justification language. This is a persuasive essay. Justification language is really important for that purpose. So how do we help her to build that language that supports the persuasive purpose? And it could be adding support, or it could be adding some detail. So going back to the why game that Kim had mentioned earlier. Why? How? Getting them to start thinking about elaboration. So hopefully you have some ideas of how you might apply the performance definitions in those 3 dimensions to student writing and bringing them to the next level. And so the final section of our time together today is really thinking about how we might develop formative assessment prompts for virtual practice or any practice as we're moving students back into school buildings. There are some sample writing, reading, speaking, listening also, but since we're talking about writing, some sample writing assessments available if you are interested in exploring those. Basically, a prompt is a way that we get students to write. And you have a million of them, I'm sure. But I also wanted you to see how students will be assessed on the Access for ELLs specific to writing, so that you can think about that for your English learners. This is the format of how students will be assessed and how we can incorporate activities into our typical writing instruction that supports the English learners even more in showing their skills on that writing assessment in that format. And again, we're always focusing on, for English learners, in addition to what we might think of as tier 3 academic vocabulary that comes from our content area, like characterization, alliteration, those pieces, we're also thinking about that functional language, that tier 2 cross-curricular language that all of the students will need to help them organize their ideas, their thoughts, and information. And those come from I showed you earlier, that scholar sheet with compare and contrast, sequence, justify, classify, predict, infer, those kinds of things we ask students to do that are also connected to some cognitive skills. So here are some examples from grade 1. There are 2 levels of the test. Tier A is reserved for those teachers. If it's a paper test, then the teachers will identify if they're the newcomer student, if they're at the beginning level of proficiency, then they would get the tier A. Students who are at the higher levels of proficiency could get the tier B, combined tier BC. And so you can see the differences here between the A. Students have the opportunity to write single words and phrases, but expand to that into sentences so that we're providing opportunities for growth. And then here for the paper test, they had a word bank, and I see Courtney says they no longer get the word box. But as we're thinking about our instruction, providing some of that functional language or the content language to help them generate their ideas. We have an opportunity in instruction. The more that they are practicing, the more likely they are to incorporate those when it comes time for the assessment in which they may not get the same support. And I'll have to double check on that, Courtney, in terms of new this year. So I'm going to look into that a bit more because the samples online, I pulled these offline and that's what we'd provide. So I will actually make a note to look into that. Courtney, what grade levels do you work with so I can ask specifically about that? Okay, I will look into that and I can contact Mary with any additional information and she can send it out to all of you who registered today. So here's an example from 4 to 5. This is actually one of the online samples. They have, when the assessment moved online, they released some items for students to practice the kinds of questions that they will get in the actual Access assessment. So here they're given a story, they'll have to listen and read a little bit about some information, in this case, a story about this young lady, and then they will have to compare and contrast to their lives. So there goes that, or there's the focus on that functional language of comparative. So if I'm helping students during instruction to build that instruction and assessment, a formative assessment, then I'm building in some of those sentence frames that support the functional language. So in their writing, I tell them I'm looking for these. You need to use at least one of these or all of these, whatever, however you set that up. For my students, what I did, and I taught middle school, we would have our anchor chart, which at that point we called our star sheet. And I would tell them anytime they wrote or anytime they had to record themselves for speaking, they had to have 3-star words or 3-star phrases. And then they could check each other's, and the partner would look for, did they have those or 3 of those? They could check themselves. And we saw phenomenal writing growth just because the star words, the phrases, help to add to the organization and the additional information. So that's why I am so passionate about it when I am in training on being very explicit and providing these supports, but that I'm then holding students accountable for using that language if that's the objective. Oops, getting a little mouse happy. So here's an example again from the online assessment for grades 6 through 8. So they're interpreting some information here, and then they will need to, I'll read out the directions in case it's too small, but look at the diagram showing the assembled equipment. Write a paragraph of at least 8 sentences explaining how Camilla will use the equipment to find out which of the liquids has the highest boiling point. So there's some cause and effect language that would be important here. You know, she used the equipment, X equipment, in order to blank, or since the, you know, the thermometer showed blank, she knew blank. So building in some of that cause and effect language. Again, the more we do this in practice and we're explicit with students about this is the expectation to use this functional language, when they're on an assessment and they don't have those sentence frames, they've still started to internalize a lot of that because it's become such a routine and expectation for them to use that language. And then here's a 9-12 example. They are going to, or they're getting information about these 2 architects, and they have to read all of this, and some of that will be read to them. And then they have to write an essay arguing which architect's work was more important, and then support your choice. And so this is where the argumentative or persuasive genre comes into play, where students will now need to justify as part of their argument. And in this case, it's also appropriate to compare because we have to say why one architect's work was more important than another's. And so again, really thinking about what's the functional language embedded in the tasks that we're asking students to complete. So with that, I just want to point you in the direction of the other presentations that are available. Lots of great topics for integrating quality writing instruction. And then hopefully we have attended to the outcomes. You have some more ideas for how to apply practices for building writing within your instruction for English learners. I would like to invite you to sign up for the English Learner newsletter, and we'll put that link in the chat box. And that's how you can stay up to date with professional learning opportunities, resources, and just any updates related to English learner instruction within Virginia. And do want to, as Carla had mentioned earlier, we do have sessions sometimes every Monday, sometimes a couple of Mondays a month, but at least once a month from 4 to 5 where there is a teacher or leader presenting for most of them. I do present some of them on a variety of topics. So you can see on the left-hand side, these are the ones that we have recorded previously, and you can click on this link and have access to any of our prior recordings. There has been one specific to literacy instruction, best practices for grades K2. There have been others for, scaffolding academic tasks. So you can see a variety of topics that are available in recording form for you as well. So thank you for your commitment to equity and really supporting language development and literacy development for your students. If you have any questions about English learner instruction, education programs in Virginia, please do not hesitate to email me. And thank you for your attention and participation on this Saturday morning.
Thank you, Jessica. I think we all have a lot of ideas, new ideas from what you presented. Sometimes we believe that, there's so much we can do that is so hard to choose from different strategies. But I really like the part where you were talking about persuasion. Like personally, that's what I need to do with my middle school students. And they are very successful when they receive all the guidance and not just killing the writing, killing the paper, just saying, okay, look at this, or pointing things that they can do better. So like personally, I really appreciate this opportunity for all of us. Mary, I don't know if you want to say anything regarding the presentations.
I just want to remind everyone that for every presentation, including this one, there's a feedback form, and we will correlate all those and be sending you professional development learning points, but you have to fill out the feedback form so we know that you have attended the presentation. There's links to the feedback forms next to each of the presentations and also on Dr. Costa's page. Just a Google form.
Can we go ahead and add that in the chat? Please, and thank you.
Good, this was great. I learned a lot myself. I worked with newcomers 1 year and I had a lot of learning to do. So I really appreciate all that you did. That's our program for this morning. Thank you everybody for joining in.
Take care and stay well. Thanks so much. It was my pleasure joining you and spending this time.